Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to pick up on just the final item that we discussed at the end of last class. Just to alert you in case you hadn't seen it, I posted an article showing that a recent study indicates that the 13 states that have raised the minimum wage have experienced stronger economic growth than those states that have not. It's, in my judgment, very difficult at this point to establish any kind of causal relationship between the two variables. My hunch is that, at least at this time, it would make more sense to suggest that those states that have more significant economic growth or more robust economies feel better able to, are more likely to raise the minimum wage because they think they can afford it, or because the cost of living is higher in those states. I'm not sure exactly what combination of reasons, but in any event, there does seem to be some correlation between stronger state economic growth and raising the minimum wage. Whether that will continue is another question. Today, however, I want to talk about foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy specifically, and I assure you that my view will not represent the dominant thinking in the country among those who make foreign policy. There are actually both conservatives and progressives who do, however, share much of my view, and I'll try to make the best case of it that I can. I want to explain how I take a look at foreign policy. I would say I am patriotic. I love my country. I love its most noble values. My family is an immigrant family that came here well over 100 years ago. Well, not well over, but over 100 years ago. But if political science and the study of foreign policy was based on one's nationality, American political scientists would say we're the greatest country in the world. Mexican political scientists would say they're the greatest country in the world. Canadian political scientists would say, no, we're the greatest country in the world, and everything we do is right, and all of them would be wrong. It's not my job to play favorites as a political scientist. It's my job to try to analyze and understand and then evaluate what international politics and foreign policy are all about. Anyone who does this has to have assumptions. I have assumptions. And one of them, and they're, I think, empirically based. First, international politics is kind of like a game with 200 or so national players, as well as many international organizations and alliances. This is just simple math. You can count them. You can count the number of nation states. You can count the number of treaties and alliances. You can count the number of international organizations, which, by the way, would include multinational corporations. The second assumption I make is that as a consequence of 200 or so nation states being the major players in foreign policy and international affairs, that nationalism is the single most important global force in the world. What I mean by nationalism is a sense of shared national identity that people have, and desire for and a belief in the need for their own political sovereignty. That can take various forms, but it seems to me hard to deny that Peruvians probably think, probably love Peru more than any other country and identify with it more than any other country, that the French do the same for their own country, just like we do. So, no country and no country's quote-unquote bad actions get a pass as far as I'm concerned. I confess I'm more likely to be critical of my own country because I want it to be and to become closer to the humane ideals we claim to stand for. I can criticize Colombian foreign policy or disagree with Colombian foreign policy or Brazilian foreign policy or Belgian foreign policy, but I don't even speak their language. And I'm not a citizen. Why should they pay any attention to me? And I don't feel about Belgium or Peru what I feel about the United States. So as a consequence, I probably am know more about my own country's foreign policy and would therefore probably see more things I disagree with. So Madeline, a student in the class, raised what I thought was a very interesting question in the discussion board, and I posted a response, and this is part of the response, and this also has to do with kind of my view of how one should understand foreign policy and where it came from, and we'll talk more about that. So my view is that isolationism is not a viable or a sensible policy, foreign policy in the world as it exists, and President Obama and other presidents talk about engagement and engaging the rest of the world. It seems to me we have no choice in this matter. The question is, what are the terms and principles of engagement that serve the interests of the American people? And this is really hard to determine. One of the things I think President Obama got criticized for that I really agree with is he said in terms of foreign policy, it's reasonable to hit singles and doubles. And what he meant by that, I think, is that achieving shorter-term foreign policy goals is possible. Let me step back a minute. Policies have goals or ends, and they have means. And I've already previously argued that it's really a mistake to think about public policy in terms of in any kind of linear step-by-step policy process fashion. Nonetheless, what a program or a policy, and they are different, are designed to do is to achieve some specific goal, mission, and something. It's supposed to achieve something, and you use various means to get there. And I think what the president was suggesting is that it's possible to achieve policy goals, foreign policy goals, that are modest, and that it's much more difficult to achieve foreign policy goals in a world of 200 nation states that are very sweeping. So I'd say here, I'm skeptical of goals like making the world safe for democracy. That was President Woodrow Wilson almost 100 years ago. Or today, defeating terrorism. I would argue that goals like these are not achievable and they're not realistic. They may be desirable, that's neither here nor there. I'd like a pony, okay? I can't have a pony. And you can want the world to be safe for democracy. You can want everybody to be a democracy. It's not going to happen. Just like, in my judgment, defeating terrorism is not going to happen. This doesn't mean that all big picture foreign policy goals are mistaken. Opposing Germany and the Axis powers in World War II, it seems to me, is an obvious and necessary exception to the argument that I just made. I'd like to provide some historical context, which is very important, which of course nobody on television or in the media ever does, so that to better understand where we are in terms of foreign policy and international affairs. The context that is powerful at this point, I think, is that Western powers, including the United States, colonized much of the rest of the world in recent centuries till the end of World War II. And at that time, the end of the war and the foundation and the founding of the United Nations accompanied a process that's still going on, in my judgment, of decolonization and the establishment of new independent nation states. And these states, including their boundaries, were shaped substantially by those colonial powers. And there were anti-colonial wars and movements. One of the more famous is Algeria, Vietnam, and other, that helped bring about decolonization. Later on, the Soviet Union experienced its own decolonization as it dissolved, and its client states became independent nation states. So all of these newly formed states in the last 70 years, they're varied. Some are very poor, others are oil rich. They've been called less developed, undeveloped, underdeveloped, third world, and so on. And one way to think about the Vietnam War is that it was a continuation of colonialism in a new manner. The Vietnamese defeated the French colonizers in 1954, and unfortunately the United States slowly but increasingly stepped in to fill the role of the defeated the French had played. We did so under the guise of preventing the spread of communism. I don't think that was ever a persuasive claim. So what I would argue is we're in the earlier stages still of newer self-governing nation states with real sovereign power evolving in much of the world. The transition, however, is a painful one, and it's reflected in, and this was a response to Madeline's question, the number of U.S. bases and installations scattered around the world, the emergence of a handful of important countries that have largely become independent, China, Brazil, India, huge U.S. military expenditures, frequent military interventions, too many arms sales, which the Russians are also heavily involved in. Many of these nations still are not stable. Some are failed nation states. And so the transition to nationhood has been difficult for many of these peoples. What remains, I think, is that nationalism is a powerful force. And I would like to show you here, I think, yes, this is a map of the world, not a very good map, but a map nonetheless, of colonialism in 1945, and the major colonial powers, the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, the U.S., and the Soviet Union. And so you can see a great many, mostly, but not totally, countries south of the United States, south of Europe, and south of Russia were colonized. A few in South America and Central America, but almost all of Africa and much of Asia, and some of the Middle East. And so this is the area of the world that is trying to determine what being a nation really means. I might note that the Constitution of the United States was ratified, went into effect in 1791. If you add 70 years, you get to 1861. So what was going on in the United States in 1861? Anyone know? You must have taken American history. What was going on in 1861? Who was president?
Lincoln.
Yeah. Huh?
Lincoln.
Yep. And what was going on?
Civil War.
You're right. And it was a horrible civil war, with hundreds of thousands of people killed. Now do the math. Take 1945. Add 70 years. What do you get? 2015. 70 years. So, 70 years after our Constitution went into effect, we were at each other's throats killing each other. Should it be a shock that 70 years later, after being colonized, many of these peoples, sometimes with our help, are still at each other's throats trying to figure out where they're supposed to be going, where they want to go? Okay, so one of the things to keep in mind is that as decolonization proceeded, one of the major sources of the problems not only they have, but the world has, is that the colonial powers pretty much drew the boundaries of these new nations. If you want to know why Pakistan and India are at each other's throats constantly, go look at how the British drew boundary lines and included in Kashmir, created the boundaries of Kashmir in a way that makes it a source of major conflict between the two countries. Look at the Middle East, which the British also carved up and drew boundary lines. Not alone, French were there too. That has had an impact. I mean, one of the things, you can't have a nation state without national boundaries. If the boundaries are drawn by an outside power without respect or knowledge or consideration of the long history, culture, ethnicities, religions, and so on of the people there, why wouldn't that cause problems? So, in 1945, the U.S. plays a key role in the founding of the United Nations. Even as today there remains in the United States some antipathy toward the United Nations, even though we were largely, if not totally, the architect of that body. As you're probably aware, the aftermath of World War II posed several different challenges to the United States and to U.S. foreign policy, besides the whole decolonization process. One was the fairly quick emergence of Russia, our World War II ally, as an adversary. Or at least as a perceived adversary. And very quickly we developed a Cold War between Russia and the United States. And one of the reasons this is important is because the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States was one that involved the two major powers on the planet. And so political scientists began to think about the structure of power in the international arena as a bipolar one. that is revolving around the power of the United States and the power of the Soviet Union. And the major U.S. response to the end of the war, two of the major responses to the end of the war and the emergence of Russia, the Soviet Union, and the devastation that Europe experienced as a consequence of the war, were first containment policy and second the Marshall Plan. So George F. Kennan, a Russian historian, was the fellow who developed the theory of containment. And the theory of containment was developed as a foreign policy strategy to contain the spread of the Soviet Union. And it was employed reasonably successfully for many years. Second thing the United States needed to do, or chose to do, importantly, was to rebuild or to help Europe rebuild in the aftermath of the war. If you go to, I lived in Bologna, Italy for the better part of a year, and you could see that some parts of this city were actually rebuilt after World War II, and that many other parts, fortunately the majority of the city, was still much older, centuries old structures. But the purpose of the Marshall Plan was for the United States was to help rebuild Europe after the devastation of World War II. The Cold War continued for more than 4 decades. And during that time, there were a number of what I would call proxy conflicts between, or even proxy wars between Soviet Union and the United States. Korea, although that was really as much China as the newly emerging communist China as the Soviet Union. Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. And frankly, none of these 3 countries is a critical part of world politics. I'm not trying to disrespect them. I'm saying neither of these 3 countries is really a critical actor in U.S. foreign policy or in global politics. Obviously, Cuba was perhaps most important in terms of the United States' security interest, because the Soviet Union in the early 1960s put missiles on the island of Cuba, and that led to an embargo and probably the closest the world's ever come to some kind of nuclear exchange. In the aftermath of World War II, but at the beginning in the 1950s and the 1960s and continuing, the United States was involved in either directly or indirectly in overthrowing a number of governments that it felt were unfriendly. Not threatening to the United States, but unfriendly. Iran, Chile, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Panama, Grenada, and others. This continues into the 1980s, and maybe even longer. If you have a foreign policy that is based in some significant measure on either direct or indirect invasions and overthrows of foreign governments, you're not going to be too popular. And so this was a pattern that has perhaps subsided a bit, although U.S. intelligence agencies are very much still involved, of course, across the world. And probably the bulk, if not all of it, but certainly much of the focus of overthrowing governments has been in Central and Latin America. So that's important to know that. And then something really unusual, unexpected maybe, but profound occurred, and that is the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that's what I referred to earlier when I talked about, the decolonization process with regard to the Soviet Union. All of the countries which were under Soviet control, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Lithuania, Slovakia, was part of Czechoslovakia then, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, all of those countries and others, Russia, Ukraine, and some others became independent nation states. And this was a huge blow to Russia, and really represented the end, from a point of view of political scientists, represents the end of a bipolar structure of power in the world. Soviet Union is no longer exists. It's Russia, and they're not happy. And in fact, there was even a recent survey published that shows that two of the most unhappy peoples on the planet are Russians and Americans. But what this means is that the structure of the world political order changed. However one wants to criticize the Cold War, the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, for more than 40 years, it was a pretty stable structure. There was the United States and its allies organized around NATO. There was the Soviet Union and its quote-unquote allies organized around the Warsaw Pact. And then there were all these quote-unquote third world countries that were emerging out of colonial rule. And many of them were so-called neutral. So what you have with the fall of the Soviet Union is the emergence, slowly, but over the course of, say, 20, 25 years, of what I would call a multipolar world. One of the headlines this past week was that China's economy is now larger than our economy. Does that mean very much right now? No, probably not, in and of itself. But a multipolar world is one where it's different from a bipolar world. A bipolar world has two major powers. A multipolar world has multiple power centers. We have now the United States, we have China, we have Japan, we have the European Union, we have the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which I already mentioned. We have the Middle East and its substantial oil reserves. And we have two other dimensions of a multipolar world. First, we have terrorism, or what might be termed asymmetrical conflict. Asymmetrical conflict means when one talks about war, normally it's one country against another country, or it's a bunch of countries against other countries, and they have armies. Nation states have armies. They may be big, they may be small, but they have armies. Many have navies. They have air forces. Terrorists have none of that. The means of violence that are associated with terrorism tend to be different from the means of violence associated with nation-state armies. And so that's why it's called asymmetrical conflict. We also have, in many parts of the world, a growing regionalism, a belief that the need for peoples, regions, specific ethnic groups, their desire for self-determination, for any number of reasons. And you can see this with French Canada. You can see this in the recent vote in the United Kingdom, whether Scotland was going to separate from Great Britain. You can see it in Spain, a recent vote, in Catalonia. You can see it in Italy, where the people in the northern part of the country are really not too thrilled. Their point of view, they've been supporting the southern part of the country for a long time. And these kinds of, maybe one of the better known examples is Czechoslovakia, which is a country of maybe 12, 13 million people, split and became the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And Slovakia is now a country that's got 5 million people. It's not even as big as Indiana in terms of, probably in terms of size or population. Maybe size, but not population. So these are some of what's emerging in a multipolar world. Some would like to suggest that the United States is the world's only superpower. In a sense, that's true, but it really, it seems to me, understates the limits to power and the difficulties of exercising power in the world we live in. Any comments or questions at this point? So I want to define foreign policy and then talk about some of its dimensions. And some people talk about foreign policy in terms of a toolbox, that there are different strategies, there are different quote-unquote weapons or different tools that U.S. foreign policy makers can employ. The goal, a foreign policy can be defined as the goals that a government wants to achieve globally. And that involves policies, more specific programs, techniques, strategies that are used to achieve those goals. Some of the tools in the toolbox are diplomacy, persuasion, and negotiation. Another is economic and humanitarian aid and trade. Another might be technical and military assistance. A fourth might be arms sales. A fifth might be military positioning. That's, bases and that kind of thing. And installations, as well as the location of the U.S. fleets, military weaponry and military action, and of course, intelligence. There are other kinds of tools as well that we'll mention here. Some political scientists distinguish between two types of power when they talk about foreign policy. One might do that more generally as well. That is, there's hard power, what they call hard power, and soft power. The former, hard power, tends to be coercive, while the latter might be described as attractive. Hard power refers to coercive tactics, the threat or use of armed forces, economic pressures, sanctions, boycotts, blockades, assassinations, subterfuge, intimidation of various kinds. Hard power is generally associated with what appear to be stronger nations, and because those nations are more likely to have a significant military capability. Sometimes a military capability that could change under certain circumstances the domestic affairs of other nations. But there are also instruments of soft power. These include debates on cultural values, dialogues about political ideology, the attempt to influence by setting a good example, the appeal to commonly accepted human and international values and norms and rules and institutions. The means of exercising soft power include diplomacy, humanitarian aid, disseminating information, People exchanges like the Fulbright program, analysis, propaganda, trade, cultural programming. In Cincinnati, for example, there's an organization that regularly coordinates visits of business leaders, professors, government officials who are from foreign countries who are coming to the United States, and they meet with various professional and business and political leaders in Cincinnati and in the greater Cincinnati area. That would be an example of soft power. Just as the United States government sponsors programs for American journalists, professors, academics, and students and others to go and study and do research abroad. So we just have a few more minutes, and wanted to show you some data on hard power and soft power, especially hard power. This is a chart from Jane's Aerospace, Defense, and Security for last year, showing the top 20 national defense budgets. And this is a pretty staggering image. It shows that the United States spends so much more. Frankly, the United States spends as much on defense as the next 19 countries do. One of the questions this chart raises, I think, is, well, a couple of questions. One is all of this spending really necessary? Because it's so off the charts. Now, another question it raises is, are we that, as a people and as a nation, are we so militarily insecure that we are threatened by these other countries and that have much less military capability? And if we were to put terrorists down here, it would be the smallest fraction of what Algeria has. So, to me, this is an eye-opening image. Per capita spending. Per capita spending, 2013, per capita spending means how much does a country spend on the military for each person in the country, each citizen in the country. And as you can see, the leaders are Saudi Arabia and Israel, followed close behind by the United States, and nobody else is even close. So whether one looks at gross military spending figures or per capita spending figures, the United States is well ahead, dramatically ahead of almost all other governments on the planet. And this is an image that shows the composition of defense spending over a 50-year period. And what we can see is that pay for personnel is relatively stable, that weapons procurement, that spending on weapons tends to fluctuate with military operations. The more military operations we have and the more we spend on war, the more likely it is that we'll spend more on weapons systems. And then the blue is military operations, conduct of war, and you can see that since 2001, that has dramatically increased. And so those are very, large costs in the last 10 or so, 10, 12 years compared to earlier decades. Research and development seems pretty stable. construction, nuclear programs are very small. So in terms of military spending over a 50-plus year period, this is where the United States, or how the United States is spending that money. Here's an image of U.S. foreign aid as a percentage of gross national income. And so what this shows, as again, it's important to keep in mind, it's not gross foreign aid dollars, it's foreign aid spending as a percentage of the overall income of the country. And so what you can see here is the United States is among the very lowest of the developed countries. Only Japan, Greece, Italy, and Korea are lower, and Japan has been in economic, well, in a recession for 20 years. Greece and Italy are among the most hurt in terms of economic decline in Europe, and then Korea. So we're among the, in terms of, again, in terms of actual percentage foreign aid as a percentage of our national income, we're pretty low. The nationally agreed upon target is 0.7 of 1% of gross national income, and you can see that the United States is well below that. Frankly, it's only about 30% of that. So I think maybe what we'll do is let me just see here what the next slide is. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is conclude with this last slide. What are the goals of U.S. foreign and defense policy? Well, first I want to say the perennial foreign policy problem is you can't get there from here. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, well, let me step back. You've all seen how difficult it can be for Congress to pass a law. If you don't pass a law, you probably aren't going to be able to achieve a policy goal, because a law inevitably embodies one or more policy goals. Achieving foreign policy goals is, in a world of 200 nation states, is enormously difficult. If you think achieving domestic policy goals is difficult, achieving foreign policy goals is really hard. And so one should expect, if one thinks about it reasonably, keep in mind you have issues of distance, you have different issues of different cultures, different peoples, different religions, different languages, different histories, different political ideologies, different governmental systems, different economies, different traditions. We should expect that getting the rest of the world to do what we want it to do is going to be pretty hard. And the same goes for other countries. Those countries also, if they're acting reasonably, should expect that getting the rest of the world to be and do what they want to do is going to be very difficult. So let's leave it at that for now, and we'll get into the more specifics of foreign policy goals and foreign policy governmental institutions next time. Have a good day. See you next week.
Thank you.